everyone. My name is Daniel Yudkin. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Pennsylvania in social psychology. I'm also Associate Director of Research at More in Common, which is an organization that's devoted to understanding and bridging political divides. I'm really excited to be speaking with you today. I'm sorry I couldn't be there with you in person. I was called away by a wedding party of a good friend of mine. And I want to thank Peter Biro for having me speak today. One of the titles of our conference is Heroic Citizenship, and I get the sense interacting with Peter on the phone and online that he really embodies that mentality. Today I want to speak with you about some ideas I've been developing in collaboration with my colleagues at More in Common. And these ideas came in part as a response to an article that we read that was written by David Brooks in the New York Times in late 2018. And Brooks writes the following: "The people in the exhausted majority have no narrative. They have no coherent philosophical worldview to organize their thinking and compel action. When they get one, I suspect it will look totally unlike the two dominant narratives today." Now, Brooks' article got me thinking. Every era has its own ism. There's communism, socialism, liberalism, conservatism. What would be the ism of the 21st century? Imagine we could open the chapter book of Western democracy and to a fresh page and write whatever we wanted. What sort of things would we write? What sort of values and commitments would we be writing on that page? And so what I'm going to talk about today is one potential response to that question. And the ism that I'd like to explore today is something called potentialism. It's called potentialism because it's based on the idea of human potential as defining certain rights and responsibilities that we as citizens hold both to ourselves and to our government. So just to dive right in, to understand potentialism, first what I'd like to do is bring you back to the year 1776, when Thomas Jefferson and the Founding Fathers of the United States drafted the Declaration of Independence. Now, the Declaration of Independence was, of course, a political document. It was something that put into written word the fact that the United States was declaring itself independent from British rule. But it was also a philosophical document. It was the first time that certain ideas about the nature of the human condition had been codified and written down in exactly this way. And in particular, famously, one of the most important elements of the Declaration was the fact that the Founding Fathers took certain words, certain ideas to be self-evident. Namely, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, this last idea of the pursuit of happiness, I think, is a really, really important one, and it's something that I think when we understand what Jefferson meant when he talked about happiness, really has ramifications for understanding our present-day political predicament. So to understand that, what I'm going to do is outline some research that I've been doing in collaboration with More in Common, and then tie that back in with why I think happiness is such an important topic for understanding our today's political situation. More in Common undertook an 8,000 person survey of the political landscape in the United States. And one of the things and this was in 2018, one of the things that set this survey apart was our emphasis on the psychology underlying political behavior. So we take to be very important decades of research in the social sciences suggesting that people's political beliefs are only really understood by understanding the underlying psychology and motivations that give rise to them. And so with this in mind, we undertook this large-scale study, and the study consisted of two parts. The first part, we asked people simply their political views about a variety of issues, about immigration, about the about abortion, about gun control, etc. Then we asked them a series of questions about their core beliefs. We call them core beliefs because we think that these are underlying views that influence the way that people see the world and what their values are. And what we find when we analyze the results is that in order to understand people's political views, you really have to understand what their underlying core beliefs are. And let me give you an example of what we mean. So we asked people their views about a variety of topics we call moral foundations. Now, moral foundations are a series of concerns that people have that reflect their commitments to various moral topics. So, for example, people could have concerns about authority, about loyalty, about fairness, about care. And what we find is that when you ask liberals what their primary moral concerns are, what their moral foundations are, they tend to emphasize fairness and care. Conservatives, on the other hand, tend to put a great deal more emphasis on the foundations of authority, of loyalty, and purity, sanctity and purity. And so what this suggested to us, and this is in corroboration with a variety of other findings that have been done in the social sciences, that to understand political belief, you have to understand the psychology underlying it. Now, with that in mind, I'd like to actually turn back to this question of what Jefferson meant when he was talking about happiness. So, to answer this question, one thing that we can do is to get a better sense of the context in which this word happiness was written. Now, we know that the Declaration of Independence was based in large part on the philosophy of John Locke, the great Enlightenment philosopher who wrote about the social contract. In particular, John Locke wrote the following passage: "The state of nature has a law of nature to govern it, that no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions." And we can certainly hear echoes of this passage in the language of the Declaration. But as you'll notice, Jefferson changes the word possessions to the notion of happiness. And this, I think, has been a critical element of not just American democracy over the past several centuries, but of other democracies as well. So why did Jefferson change this word to happiness? Well, to understand that, we have to understand the philosophy of Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson was a self-avowed Epicurean. That means that he followed the doctrines and the teachings of Epicurus. Now, Epicurus is generally known as someone who advocated for personal pleasure as the highest moral good. He believed, and is known to believe, that people's moral obligation is to fulfill the greatest amount of happiness for themselves and others. But this isn't the only thing that Epicurus said. It's important to understand the kind of happiness that Epicurus was talking about when he was talking about this being the highest moral good. And this is something that Jefferson actually knew. In fact, in a letter to a friend of his in 1819, Thomas Jefferson wrote the following in the bottom margin of the letter: "Happiness is the aim of life." Now this is a reflection of what he wrote in the Declaration of Independence, but then it keeps going. "Virtue is the foundation of happiness. Virtue consists in prudence, temperance, fortitude, and justice." Now, I think this is really, really important for understanding what Thomas Jefferson had in mind when he was talking about happiness. What he's showing here is that the happiness in the Declaration doesn't just consist of a fulfillment of one's own desires or self-fulfillment. It also consists in the ability to temper these desires with self-restraint. I like to think of these as the watering and the pruning components to happiness. So imagine a houseplant, for example. A happy houseplant needs to be watered, it needs to be nourished. But it also, occasionally, in order to live in harmony with its surroundings, needs to be pruned. And so I think that Jefferson really had both of these components in mind when he was talking about the pursuit of happiness. The nourishing of human potential, as well as the cultivation of it that comes along from a pruning and self-restraint of that potential to find its best direction. So we can call this this sort of duality of happiness that, according to Thomas Jefferson, let's call it Jefferson's dialectic, because it reflects this sort of dual element of what Jefferson considers to be human flourishing or happiness. Now, I think there's something in this dialectic that has bearing on the present day. Because if we look into the sorts of psychologies that are driving people and driving political disagreement today, we see what I think might be a similar tension. So consider the following question. Do you think it's more important for children to be curious or for them to have good manners? Our research with More in Common suggests that a vast majority of liberals choose the first answer: curiosity, creativity, self-fulfillment. whereas the vast majority of conservatives choose the second. Good manners, respect for elders, self-restraint. Here's another. People's outcomes in life are largely determined by forces outside of their control. Which do you agree with more? That people's outcomes in life are determined by forces outside of their control, or people are largely responsible for their own outcomes in life? While 4/5 of conservatives endorsed the second tenet, the same proportion of liberals endorsed the first. They believe that people's lives are mostly dictated by forces outside of their control, whereas conservatives think that people are mostly in control of their own lives. And so I think that what we're seeing here, again, is a pattern that seems to that echoes Jefferson's dialectic. Liberals believe that human flourishing and human happiness comes from nurturing people's innate gifts. When people fail, it's because they're failed by the system. They weren't given enough water to flourish. Conservatives, on the other hand, believe that the path to happiness comes from self-restraint and self-discipline. So when people fail, the responsibility falls on the individual. And this difference in philosophies is reflected in people's views about various political policies, for example, taxation. If as a conservative you are more focused on individual capacities to lift yourself up, then you're going to endorse a less generous taxation policy. Whereas for liberals, if you believe that the system is ultimately responsible for nourishing people's innate potential, then you're going to ultimately endorse a more redistributive or equitable taxation policy. And so in this way, what I want to show is just this idea that I think that political division today is in some ways still a reflection of this Jeffersonian dialectic that's enshrined in the Declaration of Independence. So how do we reconcile this tension? And this is where potentialism can come in. Potentialism is an ethical framework that builds on the dialectic in the Declaration of Independence, to clarify the rights and responsibilities of citizenship. Potentialism starts with the assumption that it is citizens' right and responsibility to live up to their innate potential. Every individual is born with a certain set of gifts and passions that it is people's responsibility and their right to cultivate. The greatest sense of meaning and purpose that we can get as human beings is to identify these gifts and then to explore them and ultimately cultivate and live them out to their truest extent. And we as citizens should have the right to an opportunity to explore and cultivate these gifts. Every child should have access to an education system, a healthcare system that allows them to reach the baseline minimum that can help them to explore and ultimately fulfill these innate gifts that they have. This is the watering component of potentialism. People deserve an environment, a society, and a system that they can reach the bare minimum required to invest their mental resources in exploring and developing and realizing their potential. But there's also a component of pruning. And this is where the other side of Jefferson's dialectic comes into play. Because if we accept that everyone has their own unique gifts, then to fail to cultivate these gifts and utilize them isn't just failing yourself, it's also failing the people around you. As citizens, we have a duty to engage in the process, a process of critical self-reflection that can allow us to identify what our innate and potential gifts are, and then to put them to use in making the world a better place. This is the essence of potentialism. It's the simple idea that the role of citizenship comes with an interlocking set of rights and responsibilities that are related to human potential. Citizens have a right to a world that's safe and secure, where they can explore and ultimately realize these gifts and capacities. In addition, they also have a responsibility to do so, because to fail in that goal is to fall short of our duty to use our gifts to make the world a better place. Now, maybe this seems like an abstract set of kind of wishy-washy ideas, but I think that the ideas that are encapsulated in that philosophy have a great deal of ramifications, concrete ramifications, for the world that we live in today. So, for example, it defines the minimum conditions that people should expect from their government. In the United States, for example, this means that we should be moving toward a universal system that provides healthcare for all. This is a basic requirement of human potential. As one of the richest countries in the world, it seems like a bare minimum requirement that we should do this. And Canada sets an excellent example in this regard. It also has implications for example, education. As a good education system should provide a prerequisite for the personal development that allows people to explore, identify their gifts that they can put to use in making the world better, and then to ultimately cultivate and bring these gifts to their truest and fullest potential. This needs to be a priority for us in terms of developing an education system that allows our young people to engage in this process. This is the watering component of potentialism, the nourishing component. But there's a pruning component as well, because potentialism also specifies the responsibilities that we have as citizens. We have a duty to not let our talents go to waste. We have a duty to engage in a process of critical self-reflection that can help us identify what our gifts are and what they're not, and then go to work making these gifts into fuller and more capacious entities that can be used to improve our own lives and the lives of others. And we have a duty to strive to better ourselves and to contribute to a more just society and a more just world. Ultimately, potentialism has the opportunity to give us a new way of thinking about the challenges we face in the 21st century. By clarifying the exact kinds of rights and responsibilities that we have as citizens of Western democracies, it allows us to take lessons from the past and renew the vows that we've learned historically, put them to use in a more clear and urgent way as we move forward into the challenges of the new era that we're facing today. So thank you very much for your attention. If you have questions or you want to give me some feedback on the ideas that I put forward today, I'd love to hear from you. I'm going to put my email address at the bottom of the screen. Thank you so much again, and have a great rest of your conference.